Spoilers ahead for Rebecca in the 1940s.
Spoilers ahead for Rebecca in the 2020s.
Welcome to another episode of Screenwriters Rewatch, the series where we delve into the top 250 IMDb list, pull out some classics, and see if they stand up. Today, I'm joined by Helen. Welcome, Helen. Nice to see you.
Hello.
But before we get into all of this stuff, I would love it if you could like and share and subscribe. We are really, really close on YouTube to hitting a bit of a goal of ours subscriber-wise. So if you are an audio listener, do us a favor, pop over to YouTube and subscribe to us over there. And you can see our faces too. Our faces are nice, aren't they, Helen? We like our faces.
I mean, speak for yourself.
Oh, fair enough. Great. So today we are jumping into a speeding car. We are hurtling around the streets of Monte Carlo in black and white and color. Today we are looking at Rebecca in both of her forms. That is Rebecca. Very scary Rebecca, creepy stuff. Based, of course, on the 1938 novel, which interestingly has never been out of print. I like that very much. It's a good fact for you there. Helen, tell me, what are you bringing to this rewatch? This is a fun and interesting thing. Rewatch of the 1940s, perhaps a watch for the first time of the 2020s. What are you bringing?
Well, a small confession. I stole this book. Confession. I stole this book when I was 17. This book, and I read it and loved it. And have been eagerly awaiting a remake of the 1940s, which I hadn't actually seen until recently. So yeah, but I'm a big fan of Du Maurier, and I'm a very big fan of that era. So thrilled.
Interesting. So you've seen, you're an old hand with the 1940s film then in that case.
Well, I haven't seen that one. Only recently have I watched that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I watched I haven't read the book, so there we go. I'm a Philistine. Apologies. But I watched the original film, the 1940s film, many moons ago. I think it was one of the first black and white films that I actually watched and came to, I think, through the recommendation of a grandmother or something like that. And loved it at the time, and just was so kind of taken in by it, really, really excited. And I hadn't seen the Netflix remake. It's been on my list for a long time since 2020, so about 2 years to get to, because I love Lily James as an actor, and I think taking something like this and remaking it, such an iconic movie, and remaking it is so interesting. So we're going to unpack these two films side by side, because I think that's an interesting thing to do, is an interesting way of looking at this, because of the age of the original. So the first thing I really want to talk about is the fact that these two films are beat for beat a lot of the time. There's even dialogue that makes its way from from one to the other. And you get a lot. Sometimes you get a remake, and they don't do that. They try to take it in different directions, and they do kind of different things. But on this occasion, they haven't done that. They have really, really kept it beat for beat. Did you find that a distraction, or was that something that you were happy with? And how do they both compare in terms of kind of structure and pacing to the original novel?
I think the dialogue, it definitely made me happy that it was similar, and there was quite a lot in both of the films that they'd taken from the book, so it felt very true to its original form, which was lovely. And I think classic Hitchcock, classic early cinema, it was very cut next scene, next scene, whereas the 2020 version was so much sort of smoother. There was it felt a lot, even though it was exactly the same amount of time, in film time, viewing time, it felt like we spent more time understanding and getting to know the new Mrs. De Winter, compared to before, where it seems very much based on her facial expressions of startledness and despair, and all of that.
Joan Fontaine being a hysterical woman in the 1940s. so
What
often.
they can do with their eyebrows and their eyes, it's just incredible.
It is quite something, isn't it? I think it's I agree. I think it's interesting that they've made that decision to stick so closely, and I think that's why this makes so much sense to look at these two films next to one another, because they are um in so many ways the same movie. And and it feels like that. The original, it's easy to say when you're looking at a film from the 1940s, well gosh, aren't they doing a lot of troubling things, and well gosh, aren't they, this isn't very progressive, is it? It's very easy to do that, and we can, it's worth mentioning those things, and there are some uncomfortable moments. There's some great quotes that I wrote down. um, for example, one of my favorite quotes, actually, one of my best ones, which isn't particularly unprogressive in any way, just that Mr. De Winter's sister looks at her husband and says, "Giles, you're very much in the way here. Go somewhere else." Just so,
I love that. I love
so
that. I might
blunt.
try that one out at myself and see if it works.
Yeah, you're very much
My
in the way here.
favourite was when Maxim was in the car with his lovely young bride and said, "Promise me to never be 36 years old."
Yeah,
Brilliant.
absolutely.
Which wasn't in the book. I checked. It's
Wasn't
not
in
in
the
the
book.
book. Yeah.
Interesting. So
Mm.
tell me, was the when she says, I can't remember exactly what she says now, but he responds to whatever it is and says, it wasn't a very attractive thing to say, was it?
Oh yes, he does say that, doesn't he?
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, is that was when after they were looking at their holiday snaps, wasn't it?
That's
I
right.
think.
Yeah. I think
Am
she's
I not
talking about
sure?
being jealous, perhaps. And
Yes.
then my all-time favorite line, I think possibly in any film, which is, I know, a big statement, and because it comes to set the scene, and you'll know, those of you that have seen this will remember this moment. Mr. Maxim has just proposed to his new bride, the soon-to-be second Mrs. De Winter, and he regrets the fact that it wasn't more romantic. And there's lovely things where he says, "I should have got you a lovely ring. I should have, we should have gone here. We should have done this. It should have been beautiful." And then, without skipping a beat, looks at her and said, "I should have been making violent love to you behind a palm tree." What? Where
Hashtag
where
me
does that
too.
come from? It's it's very yeah, it's there's some interesting moments in there that haven't aged particularly well. I think we can all agree. But that's the thing, isn't it? We don't. I think it's too easy to kind of linger on those things. So what I would say is that there are elements of this um that have worked quite well, and have aged pretty well, like the pacing, the structure of this, as you say, it feels weirdly modern. I think that's probably due to a Hitchcock thing, because he is kind of timeless. What have you just found in that book? You've got a
Nothing. I was just trying to see if your quote was in there, but I was
uh,
getting distracted and reading along, and I was thinking, no, I need to pay attention.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Yeah, I think that there is a timeless element to this story. The themes of it are completely universal. The idea of you know, certainly in the early kind of parts of the film, new love scuppered by something old, something coming through. This horrible, the ghost of something past. These are pretty universal ideas, and I think in that first act you kind of get behind that, and they carry through across them. What do you think, the 1940s version? What works for you? I'll say.
I think it definitely feels more authentic to the era. I
Hmm.
think although I did struggle quite a lot with the scenery, especially the interior scenes. There was very obviously in some occasions where they just put a backdrop behind a door to make it look like there was a massive long hall behind them or
Yeah,
something
I
like that.
spotted that too. Yeah,
And at the end, when the house is on fire and the car approaches, it's clearly a little tiny motor car and a lovely, beautiful little model that's on fire. So it reminded me of Thunderbirds. But that adds to the
yeah,
charm of it, I think. This
yeah,
that 80 years ago, somebody would have been sat in a cinema watching that, believing that to be real, and
yeah,
just the magic of that is lovely, just lovely. And I think at the very beginning, it kind of portrays this Maxim is this character who everyone you feel like everyone says, "Oh, he's so in love with his wife. He was so distraught when she died." So you get this feeling that, she's actually not as loved as, she loves him more and he doesn't love her that much back.
Mm.
And then when she gets to Mandalay in Act 2, it becomes almost like a ghost story, and you're
Yeah.
sort of waiting for Rebecca to appear or for doors to start opening. And in the 1940s version, they do start opening. There is a moment where a door does start opening.
Mm.
Um, and then, Danvers, the housekeeper, becomes Rebecca personified, really, the
Yeah.
one that's sort of pulling the strings and ensuring her humiliation. And as soon as Mrs. Danvers is kind of exposed as this menaceful creature, it then becomes a bit of and you're the other woman. There's sort of the fatal attraction sort of vibe going on there, with the way that Mrs. Danvers is cruelly sort of putting her in these situations, and she's
Yeah.
innocently just succumbing to it. Um, but I think what both of the films do really well is they show an arc for the new Mrs. De Winter, who we should probably mention doesn't actually have a character name.
Mm.
She's just known as Mrs. De Winter.
Yeah.
They both have this beautiful arc where she starts out as a girl, and definitely in the 40s version, even her husband talks about her being a girl. I think there's a brilliant line
Mm.
when they're about to go for a walk, and he insists that she wears a coat, and she's like, "Is that really necessary?" And he goes, "Well, you know what children are like."
Yes.
You can't
Yes.
be too
Yes.
clever with children. And so everyone's patronizing her and everyone's talking down to her. And what I loved about the 2020 version is they took it a step further, and I noticed that the statues were all looking down at her whenever she was
Yeah.
next to one, and the door handles were really high, and so she was very childlike, but arcs into this more confident woman by the end of
Mm.
it. So both of them did brilliantly at respecting that in their own little ways, I think.
Yeah. I think there are some key things there that in the 1940s version, the arc of the new Mrs. De Winter, the second Mrs. De Winter. I just love saying that out loud. It's so much fun. The second Mrs. De Winter. She there it's a little bit more clear cut. I think she has very, and again, of the time, of the era. She is this small person coming into this. She's overwhelmed immediately. She struggles to get by. She then finds some strength. She stands up to Danvers. Then Danvers strikes back. Then and then they come together with him and her and Maxim come together, and then off they go into the sunset. It's quite obviously, I'm skipping over some huge chunks of story there, but in terms of her arc,
Just a few.
it's quite just a few, yeah. But in terms of her arc, that's the simplified version of it. She starts off weak and grows to be stronger after a couple of setbacks. I think that and as it would be in a film of that era, it's economical. We're getting on with it now. Thank you very much. And whereas the modern the Netflix version of it blurs some of that a wee bit, and you see a little bit more up and down with her character and her arc and things like that. And I think the thing that really jumped out to me, the change that was made there, and again, I forgive me, I'm not familiar with the narrative of the book, but the thing from the film that really jumped out to me is the fact that they shifted the moment she recognizes the dress, and it's one of the first things that happens. She walks up the stairs and she sees the painting of the dress, and she says, "Oh gosh, isn't that lovely?" And
Mm.
they have that conversation. Whereas in the 1940s version, that happens in its own time, and
Yeah.
that suggestion is made. Now I think you can see some modern screenwriting ideas. There's a little bit of Chekhov's gun, our favorite saying on this podcast. Coming into that, you can see Chekhov's ghostly dress, perhaps is what it is. Which
Yeah.
is hidden at the beginning there, and then comes back later. Um, I think that's a really neat element of this. And also I think the original, the 1940s version, she obviously disappears in the third act for a great kind of a huge chunk of it, which I found horrifyingly jarring this time around
Mm.
to watch, and then in they changed that in the newer version. How did you find those changes from 40s to 20s? How did you find that affected the arc of that character?
I think it definitely in that third act where she goes to where well, in the book, interestingly, she goes with Maxim and they go to London to the doctor to discuss, actually what really was wrong with Rebecca.
Mm,
In the 40s film, Maxim goes by himself and
yeah,
we lose all perspective of that. And in the 20s version, um, she goes alone and uncovers the truth by herself. And that feels more in line with her arc than either the book or the 40s version, because I
mm,
think in the book she's still quite passively, oh, I just wanted to come along for the ride.
yeah.
And in the 40s one, she's not even there. And in the 20s, she is driving that plot forward herself. So I think from what we know about storytelling, I don't think it's necessarily a modern mechanism, but it's definitely the appropriate one that fits this arc in
Mm.
particular to demonstrate that she's no longer passive and she's actively in control of things.
Yeah, I no, it's a really good point. It's definitely more appropriate that she would take that control, because the whole thing is about her throwing off the shadow of Rebecca and growing into, this is I would imagine why she's never given a character name.
Mm,
She doesn't exist. She is not. She is Mrs. De Winter. That's it. She is in the shadow of Rebecca. She can never have a first name in the way that Rebecca can have a first name. And this is her whole film. The whole story is about her throwing off those shadows, and the two of them moving on together, after this terrible person has finally gone. Another significant change from 40s to 20s, which is a really weird sentence, isn't it, from 40s
it
to
is.
20s, but
I know,
we all know
creepy.
what we the death of Rebecca in the 40s version comes
Mm,
not at the hands of Maxim. She slips and falls and dies by accident. Whereas in the 20s version, he does actually kill her.
mm.
Now, I see from a dramatic point of view, it's far more dramatic to have, and the tension is, the stakes are higher because he did actually do a murder. But I do wonder. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that? What do you think about that?
I think in both examples, there's very much this view, especially from the men that Maxim interacts with. It's very much oh well, it wasn't your fault.
Mm,
You'll be fine. You're not to blame. It was the woman, and all of this lot. She was headstrong and uncontrollable, and
sure.
that I think that's another tangent we could go on. But I didn't like that in both instances the new Mrs. De Winters was totally okay with the fact that she could be with she could continue to be with someone who is violent, aggressive, you know, I
Mm.
head
Just
just losing
immediately as well.
the moment. Sorry?
Yeah. Just immediately as
Just
well. She's just immediately
yeah,
fine.
completely unpredictable behavior. They could be having an argument and before you know it, she could be dead herself. And
Mm,
again, it reminded me of Passengers a little bit, I think, in that kind of blissful, yes, okay, you've murdered me technically, but I'm going to still be with you forever.
mm,
And I guess in a
yeah,
way that is probably I don't know if that's a realistic view. I've never gone out with someone who's murdered anyone, so I couldn't say
sure,
whether that
sure.
affects your feelings. Maybe you can't just turn them off, but I think I'd like to think that it would have some moral guidance on
Mm.
whether I'd stay with them. But what
You'd
about
hope,
you?
wouldn't you?
Would you
Yeah,
stay with
at
someone
least
if they told you they'd murdered someone?
I don't know. It's the honest. I don't know that you. I don't know that this is the. I don't know. But this is the thing: is that
Mm. I
that
hope your
in a
wife is
nutshell.
listening. Uh,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
she
she's
knows.
never murdered anyone. Um, but I think that's the point, though. Really, isn't it? Like, is that she doesn't even think about it. There's no version of this where she isn't staying with him. She goes quiet for a minute because she stands there and thinks, okay, how can we get away with this? there's not a thought of, do I want to stay with him? It's just,
Mm.
how do you get away with murder? And I think that, the difference between those two things, so significantly with Maxim, I think the change in that character, Olivier's version of Maxim is just a prat. Like, there's no,
Yeah.
there are, I don't understand why, other than the fact he looks like Laurence Olivier, I don't understand why anybody would go near him, because
I know.
he's just a prick. Like, he's a bore. He's just a bore, and then spends the whole thing talking about how he's a bore as well. But and then at least in the 20s version, he has that element to him, and there is that undercurrent of kind of violence and um that sort of edge. There is an edge to this character, but he's also charming, at least, and he is kind, at least, and there are moments that do, um if not redeem him, absolutely not redeem him, actually, sorry, not redeem him in any way. There are moments that at least make you understand why someone might be interested in him, which is good, I think. But to tie it back to what we were talking about, um perhaps that's why they felt the need to have him actually be a murderer, because
Mm.
in the original film he's not a murderer. Something terrible happened. It was an accident. She was trying to coax him into murdering her, and he didn't do it. Like, she slipped, she fell, she died by accident. He did hide the body, and
He did hide the
he
body.
he did all of that stuff, but he didn't actually commit the crime. Perhaps I don't know, perhaps I'm clutching at straws here. I'm just trying to understand why that change in that character is so important, I suppose.
Mm. It is interesting, isn't it? I wonder if, um, because of the era and Laurence Olivier being this incredible,
Mm,
dreamy man that he's a poster boy, isn't he?
yeah.
Would that tarnish that if they made him a murderer, even if it was a murderer that wasn't his fault?
Mm,
If that's a thing. But I wonder if that was a, a kind of a 40s-ism to
mm,
keep him shiny and lovely and attractive and desirable.
yeah,
Mm.
quite possibly. Yeah, quite possibly, actually. I don't know. I tell you one thing. So the in terms of the structure of this, you have three very distinct acts in all,
Mm.
both versions of this. Opens in Monte Carlo. You have the kind of this ghost story middle bit, and then it turns into a detective drama. And I watched these two films pretty close to one another. Um, and I got to the end of the first film, and I was the 40s version. And I was trying to work out what didn't work for me, because there was something that I just thought, there's something off here. I don't get it. And
Mhm.
then I watched the 20s version, and I had the same feeling, and I realized it's because it switches genre. It
Mm.
goes from this kind of this thriller, this at times quite frightening, almost touching horror on occasion, in some of the tropes and devices that they use. um it's not a horror, but it uses some of those ideas.
Yeah.
um and then completely randomly, seemingly, after just her running into him down at the cottage after the boat being found,
Mm.
you get this revelation that he's killed her, and now we have to go and do all this stuff, and we go off on a completely different adventure. And
Yeah.
I realized that I really didn't like that very much, because the intrigue and the excitement for me comes from being in that house and dealing with, being in Mandalay, and dealing with the quote unquote ghost of Rebecca, the
Mm.
monograms, everything like that. The moment you leave that estate and you go off and you deal with this other thing, Rebecca's no longer a presence. And I think
Yeah,
that's
I agree.
where this story falls down. Do you agree?
Yeah, and it's almost like they've tried to squeeze in another act, because you get that turning point where, um, I think it's Danvers that in the 2020 version kind of says that she had gone to London to see a doctor, and he'd been tried to bribe Maxim had tried to bribe Jack, and
Mm,
that then becomes a new active question for the rest
mm,
of that third act. So it's almost like they've squeezed in another fourth act,
yeah.
very strangely, because that doesn't there's not five there. There's not clearly five acts, but but it is a completely different tangent. And if you took that out and it was just about the inquest and then the house burning, it
Mm,
would have been fine, totally fine. You wouldn't even need to have that extra side plot.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right, that bit doesn't work. I think if you could get away with rewriting it without it, I think the film would be richer.
I agree. I think you could conceivably have a situation there where the new Mrs. De Winter, having been thoroughly embarrassed and hurt by the betrayal of her in the 20s version, who she thinks is of as a new friend, which I thought was actually a really great inclusion.
Mm.
That twist on that, this idea that they actually, you get that lovely kind of montage of them doing stuff together and kind of being friends and things like that. I really liked. I
What
enjoyed that. I thought it was a
what
nice
wa
addition.
what was that when they were playing with the puppet theatre, though? Like, that was a little bit twee. I
Yeah, it was
didn't
weird, wasn't
quite get that. It was almost like she was still trying to infantilize the new Mrs. De Winter, and, but it was too late. She's already gone past her point of no return. She's already becoming this mature woman, so
it? Yeah,
it just felt like what grown women would do that, even in the
it was
20s, I suppose.
quite weird. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you on that. But we go through all of these bits, and she has her new friend and everything, and then what if she burns the house down?
Mm,
What if actually she's just torn apart by just you know by Rebecca. She finally is just like, I can't take it anymore. I'm gonna burn down this house, and and in it I'm gonna put you to rest. I'm gonna
mm,
destroy everything. And she accidentally sort of frees Maxim in the process. And you know I don't know. I think the ending to this film needs to be tied to the second act, and at the moment it
yeah.
just isn't. I think.
No, I agree. But
Yeah.
my absolute favorite part was just before the midpoint where Danvers is trying to convince her to jump out the window. And it's the
Yeah.
most intense, malicious, creepy thing. And you could almost believe that she would talk her into it. It's spine tingling. That's my favorite part.
It's
In both of
brilliant. And
them. Both of them are done brilliantly.
I was going to say, it does work so well in both of them, and it's so, she is played by both actors in this, in each of these, in the 40s and the 20s, um just terrifying,
Mm.
absolutely terrifying presence on screen. And I think the original, this is confusing now, isn't it? Because I'm saying the second Mrs. De Winter. I was going to say the original Mrs.
Second
Danvers.
Mrs.
This is very. We should be getting into sort of third and fourth Mrs. De Winters rather than first and second. But the original Danvers, and I don't know the name of the actor, I'm afraid, but she has this stillness about her throughout the whole thing, which I think is a is something that is included in the remake, but there is something just spine tingling about her presence on screen, that is, I think, makes it. I think really, really makes it, and I think it's one of the reasons why this film has survived and is still watched, because it is her presence, as you quite rightly said earlier on, sort of as Rebecca incarnate,
Mm.
is just terrifying. Yeah. Do you have any theories, Helen? I love your theories on films. When we sit down and we chat about things, you always have an interesting outlook on something. What's your big thing? Your kind of final thought on the Rebeccas?
Mm. Well, I think what's interesting about this is it's written by a woman, and you would like to imagine that a woman writing a woman's story from the woman's point of view, that would be, you know, sort of heartfelt, progressive. But across all of it, they describe this ideal woman is the new Mrs. De Winters. She's like an every woman, I guess.
Mm,
And they play on this in particular in the 40s film,
yeah.
in the Hitchcock film. And so she's kind and modest and childlike and meek and obedient. And they all talk about how Rebecca was beautiful and headstrong and defiant and fearsome, and those were negative traits. And when you think about Rebecca as a character, she married clearly for some sort of convenience or status to
Mm,
facilitate whatever life she wanted to have. She was accomplished and confident, and she made it very clear from day 4, I think it was, in their marriage, in her new
mm,
marriage, that she was going to carry on having fun and seeing whoever the damn well she wanted to see, and, live the life that a modern woman now can live, albeit not married. But I felt that it was a bit of a shame that there was this she obviously, Rebecca has to be the complete opposite to the new
sure.
Mrs. De Winter. They have to be on that same spectrum. But I felt it was a bit of a shame that they were saying that to be kind and modest is the ideal and that's the one that's going to prevail. And
Mm,
yet the one that's headstrong and, full of passion and desire, that independent woman is the one that we're going to say is horrible and we don't like her.
mm,
So I did think that was a bit of a shame. And what then was the theme of this story? What is Demiria trying to tell us here? What's the
yeah.
moral behind it from that perspective? And that was the discussion that I had with my writers group last night, and it went on
Mm.
for nearly an hour, and it was fascinating
What
actually
was your
to
conclusion?
explore that. I think it was a mixed bag, really. Just, I think some people were quite strongly of the view that it was just a device to make the new Mrs. De Winter, have an arc, because without being the opposite of Rebecca, there is no arc really.
Sure.
Although she never really arcs to the full extent or anywhere near as independent and headstrong as Rebecca does.
Mm,
And there were a lot of people who were just like, "But that's how it was in the '30s, and that's that." So, but then I would argue you could look back as far as Austen and see that their
yeah.
female characters are portrayed in a very different way from the era and the expectations of. Um, but it's, if ever you want to provoke a discussion, I think this is a brilliant case study for it.
Mm. I think you're right. It's a really interesting it's a really interesting element, the arc of those two, and the way that the way Rebecca is portrayed, she's portrayed as an evil creature,
Mm,
that is kind of this succubus, and is, and she's not particularly, clearly not particularly nice. There are some
mm,
decisions that she has made there. There's some mistakes that she's made for sure. For example, that's a conversation probably should have happened before
yeah,
marriage. And I can understand why he might be a bit hacked off. That, so he's sort of, there is an element there. He's been a bit tricked into marriage, perhaps he's been manipulated, things like that. I can see that. However, in a world in which we are creating these characters, there are other ways that you could have told that story
mhm,
and there are more um, overtly negative qualities that could have been given to that character without it being a kind of slightly backwards looking portrayal of
mm.
femininity.
I
Um,
agree, and also it's Mrs. Danvers that facilitates that evilness in the new Mrs. De Winter's life. She's the
mm,
one that facilitates all of this uncomfortableness, this tension, and the dress and the ball and things like that, and the cottage. It's she kind of the new Mrs. De Winter stumbles into this, and Rebecca's dead. It's
yeah,
a memory, but it's people like Maxim not telling her things and Danvers manipulating things that make that presence for her like real. And I think it's just a shame, like you say, that they chose that way, that characteristic
mm,
to depict her as a horrible person,
yeah,
because I think you could recognize Rebecca as a modern woman in this world, like today in
yeah.
2022. I think you could see that a lot.
I think you're right. It's one of those things where I'm going to bring this now to the question that we always ask at the end of these discussions: is whether or not these lie in the. We've got these two films here. Do they end up in the script department vaults? Um, I don't know which way you're going to go on this, so I'm intrigued. I've made my choice, but I'm intrigued to hear what you think.
I think I would put the 2020 version in, and I love the 1940s version for the cinematic element of it, that historic value. But I think the changes they made to the original text were reflective of society then, so I wouldn't put that one in. I'd leave it
Interesting.
out. Is that what you
Interesting.
thought I would say?
I didn't know. I really didn't know. I could have made an argument for any potential option there as to what you'd go for. So that's really interesting. I would probably do the opposite. I think
Oh,
the 40s version. No, no. You know what? No, I don't think I put either one of them in. Actually, I
wow.
don't think either one of them would go in. I love the story, but I don't think it's done yet. I don't think it's. I think from a screenwriting point of view, I would put that film in the vaults on the 40s version of the film in the vaults on merit of its cinematography and the way it's shot, the performances, things like that. I would do that, but from a screenwriting point of view, I don't. I think it leaves a lot to be desired, and I think you're right from the point of view of the characterization and those changes that they made to the original text. Not that I have that context, but I'm taking your word for it. Those changes that are there, and I think that for the, I just think that third act for me is so jarring that that's what keeps it from going in for me is that, and then the 20s version doesn't correct enough. It doesn't change enough of those elements to it. It could have painted Rebecca in a more flattering is the wrong way of putting that. As less of a headstrong woman. Damn it! They could have done less of that kind of negative element and actually celebrated that a little bit more and made and upped the problems with that character, put them into a different context, and found a different way of exploring that. They could have done that. They could have given the new Mrs. De Winter more agency, and actually had her. I think there's an interesting thing to consider there, where perhaps the new Mrs. De Winter becomes in some way Rebecca as perhaps she should have been. If you have
Mm,
an idea of perhaps Rebecca is this you know very emotionally manipulative person. Perhaps she is, physically aggressive in some way. You give her something that is more than just, the 30s ideal of what a bad woman is. You
mm,
give her something more modern in this modern era. Um, and then you could have Mrs. De Winter the new Mrs. De Winter come into herself and become this kind of a modern woman, and which does happen, but there isn't enough contrast for me, and there's too many negatives in there for it to go in the vaults, in my opinion, from a writing point of view. They are
I
both
feel
very
almost
beautiful.
convinced to agree with you.
Ooh, how
But I
exciting!
I do have one final question for you, actually.
Of course.
Laurence Olivier, as Maxim asks, makes a statement about the attractive qualities of women. So, do you, Marcus, feel that you have these three qualities? Do you know which qualities I'm talking about?
Tell me what the three qualities are. Do you think I have the three qualities?
Do
Okay,
you
tell
have
me.
these three qualities of breeding, brains, and beauty?
No, I don't think
No.
I do have the three qualities of breeding, brains, and beauty. And I shall forever lament it. And I shall have to die alone. Clearly,
Well,
what a tragedy. Helen, thank you so much for this. It's been a good, really really interesting
it has
conversation.
been
It's the
good.
first time we've
Yeah, really good.
done a comparison of an older film and a remake. There are many of them around. If you guys enjoyed that, let us know, comments or wherever you fancy. We can do some more of these. These comparisons are really really interesting. So yeah, let us know. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, Helen. Next time we're going to be
Very
back.
well.
We are
Thank
going to
you.
be looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly next time. Helen, stop your rolling eyes, please, before they spin out of your head. But I know the tumbleweed. I understand. But for those of you that are into that kind of thing, then join us next time for a conversation on that one. And we'll see you very soon. Take care, everybody. Bye
Bye.
bye.